The rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain. I'm going to read from My Life and Hard Times by James Thurber. James Grover Thurber, born 1894, died 1961. My Life and Hard Times was first published in 1933. This material is okay to be listened to by children. Introduction. The book by James Thurber that you are about to read, or reread, was published originally in 1933, a date which in many ways seems a lifetime ago, and indeed, in some ways, was a lifetime ago. Think for a moment of all the gifted writers who, since then, have come and gone, and with them their books that promised to endure and did not. Then turn to My Life and Hard Times, and observe that it has faded not at all. That, on the contrary, it is as alive and wise and funny as it was when it was born. This is, of course, another way of describing a classic, which is to say, a work that defies time and may even be enriched by it. To what may be James Thurber's secret amusement, the years since he arrived as a distinguished writer, following his earlier success as a unique cartoonist, have found him the subject of all manner of critical interpretation. He is a humorist and a satirist. They are not necessarily the same. He is by nature a bitter man who escapes from melancholy by way of comedy. He is a would-be misanthrope who is innately too cheerful to be convincing in that darker role. He is a sentimentalist about animals, dogs notably, and a realist, though usually a tolerant one, about most adult humans. An odd conflicting set of judgments, do you say? They would seem so just offhand, but then, as you grow acquainted with the abundant body of work he has created, you come to realize that each of them contains some measure of truth about him. Most of these things were and still are said also of Mark Twain, which may well have been in T.S. Eliot's mind when, reviewing Thurber as an author and an artist, he saw in his work, quote, a form of humor which is also a way of saying something serious, end quote. The man from Hannibal, Missouri, and the man from Columbus, Ohio, have much in common. To be as many-sided as this, a writer, and we are concerned here only with Thurber as a writer, must be a literary artist, both subtle and robust, which Thurber is and was from the beginning, as he demonstrated in My Life and Hard Times, portions of which first appeared in The New Yorker in the 1920s. He gained in depth and skill as he went along, of course. A genuine writer does. In The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, he was later to write with that acuteness of insight that makes the reader say, "This could be myself about whom I am reading." For who has not indulged in the heroics of daydreaming? It is a gift of the masters to convey the finality that Thurber achieved in that story. The name of Mitty has entered the language. His pathetic plight and the altogether human means by which he seeks to escape it have been drawn upon by countless other and, one trusts, grateful storytellers, along with shameless plagiarists. How many fragile, solemnly acclaimed, little red short stories will be outlived by this one? There were to be exercises in pure narrative craft, like the catbird seat, in which one could imagine a Henry James admirer, as Thurber is said to be, entertaining himself with a technically airtight plot. There were to be his fairy stories, with their grave, respectful charm and no hint of talking down, fables like The Wonderful O, in which a child could take delight and a grown-up could absorb a lesson about the meaning of freedom, and each could cross over into the other's province of enjoyment. Now, mere virtuosity is no great thing in a writer, and sometimes it is a bad and diluting one. But when Thurber moves from one point to another in his remarkable range, it is with no loss of strength or style. It is, in fact, as if he found refreshment in shifting from the straight repertorial to the comic, from the piece written with love about a dog to the macabre one whose humor barely hides a nameless terror. Consider how, in My World and Welcome to It, he daydreamed with the incomparable Mitty, was bemused by the thicket of French politics, theorized hilariously about the real murder of King Duncan in Macbeth, and remembered a cherished French poodle. That collection appeared in 1942, yet even at that fairly advanced stage in his writing life, he was regarded by many as a humorist, but astonishingly not more than that. They could not have read his nervous, nightmarish Menaces in May, a too little remembered story published by The New Yorker in 1928, or his story of a tortured lonely man. One is a wanderer in The Middle-Aged Man on the Flying Trapeze, published 1935. It is just possible that Thurber himself fostered this notion, for a while, of himself as a writer not to be taken seriously, much as did the self-deprecating Ring Lardner, with whose disenchanted comedy Thurber's darker vein has an affinity. Intent as they were on their art, the writers of the 1920s publicly cultivated a kind of off-the-cuff urbanity, and Thurber was a literary child of that decade. But the evidence is that he matured in ratio to the seriousness with which he did come to take himself as a writer, with what must have been his increasing awareness that he was not only a humorist in the American tradition of comic exaggeration, but had in him the makings of a realist who would leave a cool, explicit record of life as he had seen it. The historian who wants to know, in 2000 AD, what university and newspaper life were like in an Ohio city in the second and third decades of our century cannot possibly overlook the Thurber album. Whatever the vantage point he chooses to take, and the tone he senses is the right one for his purpose, certain common denominators are present throughout his work. He loathes cruelty. His sympathy for the out-of-luck man is as intense as his contempt for the pretentious and stupid one. He sees that children, being closer to the natural world than their elders are, have more true wisdom than adults. He finds the family life of dogs to be more rational than that of humans, and their courage and loyalty generally superior. And there is the style that could be no one else's, a most delicate and flexible instrument, sometimes casual and chatty, and then again taut as a wire pulled tight, according to the demand made upon it. In the Thurber album, he tells something of what an Ohio State University professor of English, a man of classical bent, did to shape the young Thurber's mind. It was both opened and sharpened, and we can see the result today in that style in which no word is wasted, and no effect arrived at by chance. It is not just hindsight's wisdom, I think, that recognizes how much of the mature artist is forecast in My Life and Hard Times, or the first 20-odd years of James Grover Thurber, born on December 8, 1894, in Columbus. As you are about to see, it is a wonderful mingling of farce and comedy, of remembrance sometimes tender and sometimes ironic. By the time he came to write the pieces it comprises, he had served as a code clerk for the State Department in Washington and Paris, had been a reporter for the Columbus Dispatch, the Paris edition of the Chicago Tribune and the New York Evening Post, and a contributor to and staff member of the New Yorker. In the sense approved by his 1920s generation, he had been around. But as he goes back in time to his starting point, the voice remains Middle Western as surely as his accent does to this day. He is neither the debonair expatriate making fun of his native heath, nor the sentimental alumnus returning to the old campus. As these prefatory notes on him have suggested, Thurber went on from there to do more complex work, but none finer of its kind, none more precisely successful in terms of its intention than this memoir of his boyhood and young manhood. Humor is emotional chaos remembered in tranquility, he once said, neatly rephrasing Wordsworth on poetry. How delightful is the chaos here, and how inspired is the remembering. The night the bed fell, and the day the dam broke, and the night the ghost got in, are waiting to tell you, these and others of the 10 items in My Life and Hard Times. Some of them are in a vein of farce, and more emphatic than he has since used. But even the wild scramble of the day the dam broke, you will note, has a subtly effective tactic typical of the later Thurber. That is, the dam did not break, and the citizenry's rush to safe ground was unnecessary. As early as that, in the Thurber world, people behaved rather more foolishly than a self-respecting dog would do. Everyone will have his favorites among these Thurberian memories. My own would have to include The Dog That Bit People, if only for what it says of the narrator's mother. What woman except Mrs. Thurber would have praised a dog that impaired the family's finances by biting an important business associate of her husband? The dog being clearly right, she said, because he was a student of character who recognized the victim as untrustworthy. In Thurber's Columbus, the offbeat consistently had its own superb logic. In that Thurber household, even the mice behaved oddly, and grandfather, a Civil War veteran, proved difficult only when his mind did not remain fixed in the past. It is one of the few things in my life I would like to live over again if I could. I don't suppose that I can now, the author observes at one point. He is speaking of a particular incident, but one must believe that he is thinking of that whole long-gone time. Something was always happening. The damp hand of melancholy, of which he writes in his 1933 preface to My Life and Hard Times, had not yet settled upon a generation and the world. An autobiography? A memoir? Literal-minded doubters exclaim when Thurber adherents refer to this book as being more or less specifically the truth. Who could remember all this so exactly, including conversations held 20 years and more before? Have a care, the adherents answer, because it is likely that few men living possess so nearly the power of total recall as this one does. It was true even then, when he was a younger and long before he was borne in upon himself by progressing blindness. As a psychology student at Ohio State, he scored 78% when asked to write down what he could remember of a 1,000-word article read to his class. No one in his group was close to him. And this is important because it means that the author of My Life and Hard Times had no need whatever to resort to those nostalgic fictions that infest a whole literature of childhood reminiscences. Simply and firmly, he went home. Apart from the artist's license to foreshorten time and alter the order of incident, I for one wouldn't care to challenge the most minute detail of what Thurber represents to be the truth. In sum, of course, it is the truth, in the sense that matters. All this has something to do with the fact that now, in his almost complete blindness, he is an even finer writer than he has ever been. A man less gallant, less passionately dedicated to the exactly used word, might have been crushed by the personal tragedy that overcame him. Thurber actually turned it to his advantage. "A blind man benefits by lack of distractions," he said recently, not long after he had declared that my 1/8 vision happily obscures sad and ungainly sights, leaving only the vivid and the radiant, some of whom are my friends and neighbors. If this meant that he could no longer draw as he once did, it also meant an even sharper concentration on the art that remained to him. The figures bear this out. The last 15 years have been his most productive ones as a writer. He has gone afield for repertorial pieces for the New Yorker, into his imagination for those fantasies ostensibly for children, but actually for all of us, and into his memory and the records for his remarkable biography of the late Harold Ross, editor of the New Yorker, his friend and greatly valued mentor. Another friend, Louis Gannett, the critic, has reported that in that inner world of the blind and in the silence of the night, Thurber tastes and shapes the words he will be dictating the next day, arranging and rearranging cadences, editing and discarding. When they are read back to him, he edits yet again, sometimes repeating the whole process 10 times. It is small wonder that the later prose of a man who always has been a precisionist in language is distilled to something like perfection, while retaining that apparently easy spontaneity of his early and middle phases. With The Male Animal, the Broadway comedy hit that he wrote with Elliot Nugent in 1940, what might long have been assumed became entirely obvious, that he wrote for the ear as surely as he drew for the eye. Now hearing every word in his mind before he speaks it, and then hearing it again when he does speak it, he has inevitably refined his art still further. That this art was true from the very beginning, the pages that follow attest beyond any doubt. What it comes to, in sum, is that we have here a writer original, versatile, and, except in quality, unpredictable. A new generation having come along since My Life and Hard Times made its opening bow. Some will now be meeting him for the first time. They are to be envied. Introduction was by John K. Hutchins. Preface to a Life. Benvenuto Cellini said that a man should be at least 40 years old before he undertakes so fine an enterprise as that of setting down the story of his life. He also said that an autobiographer should have accomplished something of excellence. Nowadays, nobody who has a typewriter pays any attention to the old master's quaint rules. I myself have accomplished nothing of excellence except a remarkable, and to some of my friends unaccountable, expertness in hitting empty ginger ale bottles with small rocks at a distance of 30 paces. Moreover, I am not yet 40 years old. But the grim date moves toward me apace. My legs are beginning to go, things blur before my eyes, and the faces of the rose-lipped maids I knew in my 20s are misty as dreams. At 40, my faculties may have closed up like flowers at evening, leaving me unable to write any memoirs with a fitting and discreet inaccuracy, or having written them, unable to carry them to the publishers. A writer verging into the middle years lives in dread of losing his way to the publishing house and wandering down to the Bowery or the Battery, there to disappear like Ambrose Bierce. He has sometimes also the kindred dread of turning a sudden corner and meeting himself sauntering along in the opposite direction. I have known writers at this dangerous and tricky age to phone their homes from their offices, or their offices from their homes, ask for themselves in a low tone, and then, having fortunately discovered that they were out, to collapse in hard-breathing relief. This is particularly true of writers of light pieces running from 1,000 to 2,000 words. The notion that such persons are gay of heart and carefree is curiously untrue. They lead, as a matter of fact, an existence of jumpiness and apprehension. They sit on the edge of the chair of literature. In the house of life, they have the feeling that they have never taken off their overcoats. Afraid of losing themselves in the larger flight of the 2-volume novel, or even the 1-volume novel, they stick to short accounts of their misadventures because they never get so deep into them but that they feel they can get out. This type of writing is not a joyous form of self-expression, but the manifestation of a twitchiness at once comic and mundane. Authors of such pieces have, nobody knows why, a genius for getting into minor difficulties. They walk into the wrong apartments. They drink furniture polish for stomach bitters. They drive their cars into the prized tulip beds of haughty neighbors. They playfully slap gangsters, mistaking them for old school friends. To call such persons humorists, a loose-fitting and ugly word, is to miss the nature of their dilemma and the dilemma of their nature. The little wheels of their invention are set in motion by the damp hand of melancholy. Such a writer moves about restlessly wherever he goes, ready to get the hell out at the drop of a pie pan or the lift of a skirt. His gestures are the ludicrous reflexes of the maladjusted. His response is the momentary inertia of the nonplussed. He pulls the blinds against the morning and creeps into smoky corners at night. He talks largely about small matters and smally about great affairs. His ears are shut to the ominous rumblings of the dynasties of the world moving toward a cloudier chaos than ever before. But he hears with an acute perception the startling sounds that rabbits make twisting in the bushes along a country road at night, and a cold chill comes upon him when the comic supplement of a Sunday newspaper blows unexpectedly out of an areaway and envelops his knees. He can sleep while the Commonwealth crumbles, but a strange sound in the pantry at 3 in the morning will strike terror into his stomach. He is not afraid, or much aware, of the menaces of empire, but he keeps looking behind him as he walks along darkening streets, out of the fear that he is being softly followed by little men padding along in single file, about 1.5 feet high, large-eyed and whiskered. It is difficult for such a person to conform to what Ford Madox Ford, in his book of recollections, has called the sole reason for writing one's memoirs, namely, to paint a picture of one's time. Your short piece writer's time is not Walter Lippmann's time, or Stuart Chase's time, or Professor Einstein's time. It is his own personal time, circumscribed by the short boundaries of his pain and his embarrassment, in which what happens to his digestion, the rear axle of his car, and the confused flow of his relationships with 6 or 8 persons and 2 or 3 buildings is of greater importance than what goes on in the nation or in the universe. He knows vaguely that the nation is not much good anymore. He has read that the crust of the earth is shrinking alarmingly and that the universe is growing steadily colder. But he does not believe that any of the 3 is in half as bad shape as he is. Enormous strides are made in star measurement, theoretical economics, and the manufacture of bombing planes. But he usually doesn't find out about them until he picks up an old copy of Time on a picnic grounds or in the summer house of a friend. He is aware that billions of dollars are stolen every year by bankers and politicians, and that thousands of people are out of work. But these conditions do not worry him a tenth as much as the conviction that he has wasted 3 months on a stupid psychoanalyst, or the suspicion that a piece he has been working on for 2 long days was done much better and probably more quickly by Robert Benchley in 1924. The time of such a writer, then, is hardly worth reading about if the reader wishes to find out what was going on in the world while the writer in question was alive, and at what might be laughingly called his best. All that the reader is going to find out is what happened to the writer. The compensation, I suppose, must lie in the comforting feeling that one has had, after all, a pretty sensible and peaceful life by comparison. It is unfortunate, however, that even a well-ordered life cannot lead anybody safely around the inevitable doom that waits in the skies. As F. Hopkinson Smith long ago pointed out, the claw of the sea puss gets us all in the end. J.T. Sandy Hook, Connecticut, September 25, 1933.